Good morning everybody, I think we'll make a start. Welcome to this webinar on an introduction to open scholarly communication practices, where we will give you an overview of open access as well as considering the theme of OA Week, which is this week as you know, open for collaboration. The content is aimed predominantly at the UK, but I think it should be helpful for both researchers and librarians. My name is Carolyn. I work in the regional marketing team here at Taylor & Francis, and we'll be speaking about some of the initiatives and offerings of open access from the perspective of a global publisher. Also presenting here with me today are David Walters, the Open Access Officer from Brunel University London, and Dr. Chris Daley, the Research Publications Assistant at Brunel, who also lectures in English literature. And they'll be able to provide insight into open access from the perspective of an academic library. We will have time for questions at the end, so if you could please just save them until then, and then you'll be able to just enter them into the questions box on the panel on your screen. I'll now pass over to David, who will introduce the topics to be covered here today in a bit more detail.
Okay, thanks Carolyn. Good morning everybody, thank you for coming. As mentioned, so the title of this talk is it's all about the theme of Open Access Week this year, Open for Collaboration. So we're going to present an overview of the open access landscape in 2015 as scholarship transitions towards this model. And we're going to do this from the perspective of some key stakeholders in the scholarly communications chain, so publishers, academics and universities. So the talk is broken up around the following topics. So we'll begin by discussing the importance of open access for scholarship. So we'll briefly go into the scholarly publishing ecosystem as it exists today and the processes that this is designed to support. We'll explain what we mean by open access and how this movement is designed to enhance the research enterprise. We'll then go into more detail about the different publishing models for open access, and we'll give you all the information you need to know about these emerging paradigms and what state they're in the transition today. The third section will talk about driving change. So we'll talk about the influences around the world that are having a disruptive effect on scholarly communications, and we'll discuss how funders, institutions and publishers are collaborating in this space to help drive through this change. And we'll close by highlighting a number of initiatives being undertaken by publishers and institutions who are collaborating in this space. And we'll take a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So just trying to move the slide along. Okay, so in this first section I'll begin by discussing the importance of open access for scholarship, and we'll give you an overview of exactly what we mean by open access. So a good place to begin is to try and understand the process that we're trying to support, so namely the global research enterprise and the way that research is communicated around this ecosystem. So the whole research process is sometimes compared to standing on the shoulders of giants, and what this refers to is the role of researchers in generating and sharing scholarly ideas. So their role is to question and repeat and refine scholarly ideas as they're generated, and it's all part of the research process. So these ideas and results are typically encapsulated within research outputs like academic papers, conference proceedings and other forms of output. So all the while these activities are continually adding to the body of knowledge in the scholarly record, and it's a hugely important activity in the development of our society. So research expands our horizons and brings the benefit of new knowledge to the world. And thanks to modern communication tools, the speed at which ideas can be discovered and built upon has increased dramatically. So the diagram on this slide highlights some of the milestones that take place as part of the research process. So this life cycle diagram, which was produced by Cameron Nayland of PLOS, illustrates this process very effectively. So you can see that ideas, as they're developed, planned, recorded, processed, at the end of the process, the research is ultimately published or disseminated. And at the beginning of the cycle, the research has to be picked up or communicated to peers in the community. And you can see from the extension of this diagram how this creates a chain of ideas which is preserved and contextualized within the scholarly corpus. And this is essentially what we mean by scholarly communication. And you can see here that it really does play a fundamental role in the process as ideas are built upon, extended and reused. So, ultimately, to kick off, open access is about disrupting the ecosystem as it exists today, challenging what conventions have gone before. So to wrap up this brief introduction, we'll just talk about exactly what the functions of the scholarly communication model needs to achieve and what it's actually achieving as it stands today. So, communicating research, it has to add to the corpus, to the body of knowledge that research generates. So it has to be able to register those results, it has to tell us exactly when that research took place, and provide attribution to the academics and researchers who took part. It has to be able to provide a process of quality assessment, and this is usually done by peer review processes of journals, which basically enables a piece of work to be accepted by peers of that scholarly community where ideas are accepted or rejected. Research has to be published, so it has to be disseminated, it has to reach those people in the community and around the world in order for those ideas to be found and talked about. And we also have to provide context to ideas as they're, ideas and discoveries as they're found. You kind of have to imagine the easiest thing to think about is like a journal on a library shelf. You can see all the previous issues from the very first issue all the way up to the discoveries that are happening today, and you can see each step, each year, each journal, each publication taking steps toward those new discoveries. So that context essentially provides a way for us to see exactly how those ideas have sort of transcended over decades. So it's a very, very important part of the process. It also has to reward researchers for their work. So in the current scholarly communications model, there's a lot of prestige that comes with publication. Some journals are ranked more highly than others, impact factors. It's got, whatever happens going forward, we really have to ensure that aspect of the cycle is maintained, really, because credibility and reputation are really fundamental to the career of academics and researchers. Okay, so yes, developments in technology obviously meant that the forum for sharing research moved online, and most academic journals now exist online. They used to be sitting on a library shelf, but now you're most likely to log in and search for a paper, find your papers through online PDFs, HTML from the publisher's platform online. And this happened because it was clear that this is obviously a faster and more efficient forum to share and collaborate on research ideas. But since the advent of this change, some of the challenges that still appear to have emerged is the cost of providing access to this research didn't decrease as expected. And there's still other issues around the legacy model that don't appear to have translated as well as they could within the context of modern communications. You have to remember that the old model has existed virtually unchanged for centuries, and it has worked very well, but it was essentially built within the context of a paper-based world. And a clear shortcoming that's come to light is the speed with which ideas can be shared and received and built upon in academia doesn't translate as well to this new kind of global model that we're all a part of. but open access to academic research papers is one of the first steps in this transition. So I'll just pass you over to my colleague Chris.
Thank you very much, David. Okay, so David has provided there an excellent outline of the scholarly publishing landscape and where open access sits within it. I think it's also important now to spell out precisely what we mean when we talk about open access publishing. So hopefully this slide neatly illustrates this point and sums up what open access is very succinctly, which is the unrestricted online access to peer-reviewed scholarly research, which is also free of charge for the reader and free of most restrictions on use, although attribution is still a must, and you must obviously comply with good academic practice in citing and referencing the material. The movement was defined by a series of initiatives and statements in the early 2000s, which are listed here. I'm going to now quickly show you a quote from the Budapest Initiative to further define open access. Okay, so I'll not dwell on this for too long, but as you can see, the Budapest Initiative in 2002 set out the framework for open access. I've highlighted the start and the end of this quote, as it initially sets out to define the term, which I think we've already done in the previous slide, and then make clear the wider-ranging reuse rights on open access material, before concluding by stating the following: that the only constraint on reproduction and distribution and the only role for copyright in this domain should be to give authors control over the integrity of their work and the right to be properly acknowledged and cited. If you want to read the full Budapest statement, or Budapest Initiative it's sometimes called, you can read that at the following link at the bottom of the slide. Okay, so now that we've kind of defined precisely what open access is in its broadest sense, I think it's important to move on to the benefits of open access for researchers and authors. This diagram here provides a neat overview of some of the benefits of open access publishing. I'm going to go through some of these in greater detail in the forthcoming slides, but as you can see, some of the benefits include higher citation rates, transparency for taxpayers, and greater exposure, particularly to developing countries which may not have the range of journal subscriptions seen in institutions in the UK and the US, for example. Okay, so to dig down a little bit into some of these benefits in greater detail. So for researchers, first of all, I think increased impact is a key one here. There is evidence that open access can increase the impact of scholarly works through higher citation rates, and this is sometimes known as the OA citation advantage. And following on from this, open access also increases the amount of research material freely available, which may in turn stimulate collaboration with other researchers, institutions, or public bodies who have picked up on your research. It's also a benefit to students and teachers. To provide an example from my own teaching here at Brunel, I've often recommended open access articles and our institutional open access repository to students, and this allows students instant access to research materials which can potentially be discussed immediately in the classroom. So you can almost have a real-time digestion and examination of academic research. Open access is also a benefit to universities and funders. So the increased impact from publishing open access may help with a university's reputation and enhance the chances of bringing in grant funding. Also, open access enhances the non-profit mission statements of research-led organisations in finding and sharing new discoveries. And then finally, the broader kind of general public benefit access. I don't think this should be understated, because open access research allows independent researchers the ability to access research as well as other organisations outside of HE who may potentially have an interest in research outputs. I think it's also important to stress that there is the possibility that open access may help to increase the reputation of certain disciplines. So medical discoveries, for example, which have a direct effect on hospital treatment, may be easier to market as they have an obvious societal impact which can be reported on comfortably by the media. Humanities research, however, sometimes has a more subtle social function, and greater exposure to this research through open access publishing may help to demonstrate the social benefit of the humanities and debunk certain popular assumptions about humanities disciplines.
Okay, so Chris has covered there some of the benefits of open access. You can see here on this infographic the perceived benefits of open access publishing by researchers and authors. So this is taken from the 2014 Taylor and Francis Open Access Survey. You can also see a comparison to the same survey that was carried out in 2013. So this survey had almost 8,000 respondents from around the world. I think there was about 30% from the US, about 13% from the UK, Spain and Portugal, 14% from Central Europe. So very much a global demographic. And I think what's interesting here is you can see that in every case between 2013 and 2014 there is an increase in the perceived benefits just in those 12 months. Another point perhaps worth noting from this particular infographic is that whilst 81% of respondents felt that open access would lead to wider circulation of their work, it was only 29% that then felt that would also increase their citations, which I think is quite an interesting finding. If this is something that you are interested in reading more about, then the full survey is available to download on Taylor and Francis online, and there's also some nice summary infographics there as well, which are a bit more digestible, that you can go and have a look at. Okay, I think now I'll hand you back to David.
Apologies, sorry, it was me, Carolyn.
Oh,
Apologies
okay,
there. Now we've tackled the definitions of open access and also the benefits of open access. I think it's important to mark out the two different types of open access publishing, which are green and gold. So we'll start with gold then. So gold open access is available immediately once published. There is no charge for the reader to view this research. Instead, a charge known as an article processing charge, or APC, is paid by the author of the work to the journal to recover the cost of publication. The average price is around £1,800, but these can vary from £200 up to £4,000 plus. Academics who work at Brunel do not, however, pay this charge out of their own pocket, but can apply to the Brunel Open Access Publishing Fund here to make their work Gold Open Access. Gold publications are also typically distributed with a Creative Commons license, which is the most open form of licensing and allows for widespread reuse as long as there is appropriate attribution. Green, on the other hand, this is the other type of open access publishing model. This is where an author's accepted manuscript is made open access rather than the final version of record. Green open access articles are normally deposited in an institutional or subject repository. Now, another important point to this, the Higher Education Funding Council England have recently mandated that researchers make their research green open access, often via an institutional repository upon acceptance by a journal. I'm going to talk about this in a little more detail, so I'll come back to this point. Another thing I wanted to point out, and what I've provided an image of here, is a link to an excellent How Open Is It guide, which provides a sliding scale explaining how open a particular article may be in relation to areas such as reader rights, reuse rights, and copyright permissions. Again, you can follow that link to find out more about this publication. Now we're going to talk about the different stakeholders in this new environment, as well as the numerous policies which have led to this drive for change.
This is a timeline chart showing the global open access milestones from the last few years that have really been driving the OA movement. Chris mentioned earlier the Budapest Initiative back in 2002. Since then, the UK has furthered these developments with the commissioning and publication of the so-called Finch Report in 2012, which looked at the accessibility of research. 3 years on, and arguably the UK has passed the baton to the Netherlands, who were the first nation to clearly articulate their vision of making all of their country's research published on an open access basis by 2024. I think another milestone here worth highlighting is the Gates policy in 2014. So although in the USA much of the government policy is around public access and green OA, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation were the first major funder to mandate that all of their funded research has to be published on a gold OA basis. I think what this chart also does is show the wide geographical spread of engagement with open access. It truly is a global phenomenon. And it also highlights the regional diversity, I think, around legislation for open access. So where previously research has been very much an international community, we're now seeing these regional specific legislations and policies putting a framework around the scholarly communication output. And I know here at Taylor and Francis, we work with researchers all around the world, and one of the challenges that can be faced is being able to meet the needs of such a diverse range of scholarly research legislation. So looking specifically at the UK then, Horizon 2020 is obviously a European initiative but affects us here in the UK. This is the largest research and innovation programme ever, with funds now sitting at around 80 billion euros across the 7-year period. And open access forms part of the policy documentation for this, covering both gold and green routes. The RC UK and Wellcome Trust, two of the major UK research funders, have both gold and green policies, giving their authors a choice as to which route they published. I think all they mandate on is the license type that they publish under if it's gold open access, and the embargo period under the green open access policy. As Chris touched on earlier as well, HEFCE, the Higher Education Funding Council for England, they also have a green OA policy, and I think we're going to go into that in a bit more detail shortly. JISC collections here in the UK have set up offset agreements with publishers. This is a way of offsetting the open access costs against subscription fees, and again we will look at this in more detail further on in the presentation. I think open science is very much a talking point in the academic community. So in this digital age, we're more networked, more connected, and there's a strong need to track return on investment and the impact of scholarly research. Open access raises some interesting questions around this. So with funders and institutions investing heavily in open access, how do we track the broader engagement of that research? If institutional libraries start investing their budget in APCs rather than in subscriptions, how do they then retract their return on investment and evaluate the value of that? And I think this is an area of open access that still is in the development stages.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn. Yes, so I think another key point to highlight with open access is it really is targeting that research which is publicly funded by research institutions, charities, and not-for-profit organisations. And it's really interesting when you look at the global picture, the amount of funding that comes from private sources and public sources differs quite substantially across the world between different countries. But particularly with governments around the world and other public bodies, they fund a huge proportion overall of the research that goes on around the world. And there has been, as we highlighted with some of those milestones, a worldwide commitment from a number of governments to transform the existing scholarly communications model. So there are differences in the way these models are kind of facilitating this change, but it is really important to realise that there is a kind of consensus which really is moving in the same direction. And this really does have important implications for researchers around the world, especially when the amount of collaboration that goes on research projects, which often do cross international borders and territories. Research is very often a global collaborative effort. So these different approaches mean that whilst we've all made progress, there perhaps has been a different rate in the pace of change in transitioning towards this model. So Japan, for example, has a very high percentage of its research is privately funded as opposed to publicly funded. In the UK, the majority of our research is publicly funded, which might suggest why there's been so much movement, particularly from countries like the UK and the Netherlands, in pushing forward this agenda for open access. So in the UK we have the research councils, and they released an open policy back in 2013. So the research councils are the government arm for the UK that basically funds a huge proportion of the research that takes place in this country. So it's comprised of 7 research councils that support a wide range of subject disciplines. So all authors now who receive funding from Ask UK are expected to comply with the terms and expectations set out in their open access policy. So this applies to primary peer-reviewed research articles and conference proceedings, which is what Ask UK are particularly targeting at the moment. There is support in the policy for both routes, but interestingly Ask UK came out with a preference for gold, which was in line with the the Finch report back in 2012, which indicated our government's stance on how we think the scholarly model should be applied in this country. And if Ask UK funds are used, there's an expectation that a Creative Commons CC BY licence is the standard with which that research must be shared. So Creative Commons is a licence standard for content on the web. It guarantees free access in perpetuity and specifies rights for reuse. So as previously mentioned, CC BY, the BY specifies an attribution requirement, but otherwise the content can be shared and reused in a number of different ways, which hopefully should increase the usefulness and impact of that piece of research. So if going green, lots of authors have a preference for following a green route or a gold route. Most funders will have, as with the Ask UK policy, a maximum embargo period for different disciplines, by which time they expect, it's reasonable to expect that an output should be open access to everybody within a certain period of time. So there's a slightly longer embargo period for the humanities disciplines, but a bit of a stricter time frame for the STEM subjects. In terms of driving change, a policy mandate like this might impact your choice if you're funded by somebody who has special expectations. If you're going to a journal that won't allow you to comply with the terms of those conditions, it might mean that you might have to take special measures such as negotiating a special arrangement or perhaps choosing a publisher that will allow you to meet the expectations of your funding body. And there are resources like Sherpa Romeo you can use to check, and also the terms of the agreements that you're signing to check that you're able to do this. So, another big driving force policy change from funding bodies in the UK was the establishment of the Charities Open Access Fund. So, I think this is still in a trial period. It's quite a new initiative, relatively new initiative. It's basically comprised so far of 6 very well-known funders of medical research. And so, in the same way that RCUK have put forward a new mechanism for funding gold open access, which is to have a centrally administrated pot of money which institutions manage, similarly the COAF strategy follows this approach. So the idea is that funds are being made available to authors' institutions, which authors can go through to enable them to meet the terms and conditions of their open access policy. And because all of these funders are based in the UK, we are all adopting a similar goal-led approach. So let's move on to the next one. So similarly, they have conditions on expectations, the very latest time frame by which papers can be made open access. They have a slightly different take on it, slightly different focus, should we say, because they're all medical research funders. So they have a much stricter requirement than in general the policy from RCUK. They also have relationships with the big subject repository, Europe PubMed Central, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of, which is an enormous, giant subject-based repository, particularly focusing on medical and STEM disciplines. And as previously mentioned, they're following this funded gold model, where authors apply through your institution to comply with this policy. Funders being a massive driver in transitioning the change towards an open access model. And again, the CC BY Creative Commons is really becoming a standard by which you make your paper available through the gold open access route.
Okay, so I mentioned very briefly a little earlier about HEFCI's open access mandate when discussing green open access. I think it's worth just providing a little bit more detail about this, as it potentially affects all academics in England. So HEFCI announced back in 2014 that all research articles and conference proceedings must be made green open access to be eligible for the next REF, which is currently scheduled to take place in 2020. The full policy document can be seen on HEFCI's website, hence I've provided the link there as well so you can read it in full detail. But just to provide a little bit more information about this, HEFCI have stated that all accepted manuscripts must be deposited in an institutional or subject repository within 3 months of acceptance for publication. If there are publisher-imposed embargo periods, these will nonetheless be respected and the work will still be eligible for the REF. This is due to come into force in April next year, but there is currently some uncertainty surrounding the makeup of REF 2020, and we are currently awaiting a government announcement on the likely future course of research assessment in the years to come and how this is going to affect OA policies and mandates. But this is how it stands at the moment in terms of HEFCI's open access policy. I thought it's also important to maybe link to a few open access services as well. So one of these is DOAJ, which is the Directory of Open Access Journals, and this was launched in 2003 and today contains more than 10,000 open access journals covering all areas of science, technology, medicine, social sciences and the humanities. And this is a great resource for trying to find out more information about particular open access journals. There's also the Sherpa services, such as Sherpa Romeo, which provides information on publishers' copyright and archiving policies, and Sherpa Juliet, which offers information on research funders, archiving and mandates and their broader guidelines. There's also some developing tools such as Open Access Button, which is an app and an add-on for browsers. And with this add-on you can press an Open Access button and the tool will search the web for an open version of a selected paper. If one is not available, then the button will email the author for more information. Now, these services are something that you may wish to use when you're thinking about the where you're going to publish open access or particular restrictions that may be imposed by particular journals.
So now we're going to talk about collaboration, how the different stakeholders involved are working together in this transition to an open access model. We've talked quite a bit about government and funder policies and institutions, but what are we doing here at Taylor & Francis? Well, our philosophy around open access is very much about choice. We want our authors to be able to have the choice to publish their research in a way that facilitates the greatest impact for them. Therefore, we offer them a choice of routes to publish open access, so they can choose either the green or the gold route. We offer a choice of license types, and these licenses of the ones that we offer are based on what we've been told that they want by our authors, and this does include the Creative Commons licenses for open access. We offer a huge choice of journals that they can publish their work in under open access model. Each of these has a specialist focus, an expert editorial board, but there's a very, very wide range of disciplines that are covered. Taylor & Francis is a member of the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association and also the Directory of Open Access Journals that Chris mentioned earlier, and this is with the aim of driving and sharing best practice. We know that open access is constantly evolving, so we try to take a flexible and evidence-based approach, and this is using initiatives such as our open access survey that I referred to earlier, white papers, we've got a zero embargo pilot that we're running, and as well as influencing the offerings that we provide to our customers, we also like to be able to publish these results to share with the wider community. And one of these initiatives that we're about to launch is an open access library survey, so that's hopefully something that you can look out for. We've also invested in open access with the launch of Cogent, which is a fully open access publisher that is supported by Taylor & Francis, that I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. So what do we offer? As I mentioned, we offer both the green and gold publishing route, a range of license options. In terms of where open access research can be published, we have our Taylor & Francis or Routledge Open portfolio, and these are fully open access journals. We also have Taylor & Francis or Routledge Open Select portfolio, and these are our hybrid titles, so they contain both subscription content and open access content. Also Cogent, as I just mentioned. So this is a fully open access publisher launched a couple of years ago, and they publish a series of 15 multidisciplinary mega journals covering a wide range of subjects. And as a newer publisher, they are really experimenting with some innovative concepts around open access. For example, offering what we call freedom APCs. And this is a pilot that allows authors to choose how much they pay for their APC to publish their work open access. And as well as offering greater flexibility for authors in terms of what funding they have available, this is going to contribute to a major study looking at how much authors are willing to pay for APCs in different subject areas. In terms of specific business models, we have several offsetting policies in place. Offsetting is a way of making the transition to open access more equitable for all parties, and also trying to provide a framework that makes the transition as straightforward as possible for everybody. So firstly, we have our global offset policy, which applies to all of our journals, and this is where we monitor the amount of open access content which is published in our hybrid titles. And when the amount of open access research hits a certain threshold, we then adjust the subscription price accordingly. As well as this, we have two regional offset policies in place. Both of these are pilots, and they work in very different ways. So first of all, we have one here in the UK set up through JISC Collections, whereby institutions who are part of what's often referred to as a sales deal subscription, they receive heavily discounted APCs when their research is published with us in our hybrid titles. In Austria, the model is completely flipped. So in this case, we take the amount of spend on open access, so how much money has gone into APCs with our hybrid titles, and this is used to calculate a reduction in the subscription fee for those member institutions. And I think what's quite nice here is we're able, the difference in these two models, we're really able to be quite flexible when setting up these pilot schemes to try and meet the needs of each of the consortia that we work with. On an institutional level, we're able to offer open access prepayments. So this is where an institution can deposit a certain amount of funds with us, and this fund can then be used by their researchers on the APCs when they publish their work with us open access. I think one of the biggest advantages of this is the reduction in the admin burden on the library. So we manage that account, and this can be set up as really flexibly, however the library chooses. So for example, some institutions want to deposit a prepayment with us that can then be used for all of their researchers across all of our titles. In other cases, they want to stipulate or they want to limit those funds to a particular faculty or a particular funder, and we're able to put those measures in place and manage that for them. So this is processed on a single invoice. We then manage those deductions and just send a report through to the library as often as they want us to. We also worked with libraries on initiatives such as retrospective conversion. So this is sometimes where we have an institution who has a set amount of money that they want to spend on open access with us, and we'll then work really closely with them to identify what has already been published from their institution with us, which we may want to convert retrospectively to become open access. And again, we would always put that through on a single invoice just to try and reduce that admin for the library. We're also setting up models in the emerging market, so partnering with organisations such as EIFL, and this is to try and increase the open access publishing opportunities in emerging or transitioning countries. And there'll be more details on this agreement released hopefully by the end of this week. And finally, you can see on the slide there, you tell us. So as I mentioned earlier, we are trying to take a flexible approach to this. And I talked a bit about giving our authors choice around open access, but we also want to be able to give institutions and libraries choice. And we can only do this if you tell us what you think works for you, so that we can then try and come up with solutions and business models that really meet those needs. So just a little bit more detail then on the agreement that we've got here in the UK. As I mentioned, this is set up with JISC, so institutions can choose to opt into what we call the Nestle agreement. And this is where we take the subscription spend as part of that sales deal agreement, and this is used to then calculate a number of heavily discounted APCs. So they are 75% discounted, making them £450 each for the researchers. And we will then work with the libraries to make sure they know exactly how many of those they have available, which researchers are wanting to use them. And we, again, as I mentioned earlier, we can also work with them to use those discounted APCs for retrospective open access as well. So what is the process for these open access models? I think process can be a matter of contention for libraries. It definitely can increase the admin on the people that are processing OA on a day-to-day basis. Research Consulting last year published a report which looked at the cost of implementing some of the recent funding mandates in the UK around open access. And they estimated that the cost of processing a single gold open access article was 2 hours in time, or £81 as a monetary value. Obviously that's without the APC funds, that's purely just the admin taken to process it. This is something that we have had good feedback on so far at Taylor & Francis. It's also something that I'm really keen to learn more about here in the UK. So I think it works differently at every institution, but I think one of the challenges that we found in relation to open access is where traditionally we would set up one of these sales agreements with an acquisitions or e-resources librarian. Now that there's open access information tied to that agreement that then needs to be passed on to an OA librarian or a research office, and then again to the researchers. And that chain of communication, I think, is something that we're really working on, trying to develop a good process there that works for everybody. So definitely, if you've had any experiences from your institutions, I'm always keen to hear about those, so do please email me after this presentation. Up on the screen there you can see an example of something we've put together just to try and help this process. So this is something that we found useful to share with the libraries and for them in turn to be able to then share with their researchers, trying to outline exactly how this works when working with us as a publisher. Okay, so we've talked quite a bit about accessibility in relation to open access, but I think impact is also something that's worth talking a little more about. Traditionally, authors have measured the success of their work by circulation, so how many of their academic peers have read and cited their work. However, I think impact is increasingly becoming important, both to them and their institutions, to be able to demonstrate the wider engagement of that work, and that kind of goes hand in hand with the rise of open access. So as was referred to earlier, the REF 2014 assessment that took place, that included impact stories from their researchers, showing, I think, the importance that's now being placed on this. Some of the major funders, so for example the Austrian Science Fund, are now encouraging their authors not only to make their article open access, but all of the supplementary data that goes with that research, again with the idea that making the data open as well as the finished article can increase the impact of that research as a whole. The Australian Research Council ask for information on the estimated impact at submission stage when they're receiving their funding applications, and this is something that they take into account when allocating their funding. They also have a working group in place who are dedicated to demonstrating and reporting on the impact of their funded research. Publishers as well are getting involved with this, so Cogent, the open access publisher that I mentioned earlier, publish public interest statements alongside the abstract of every single article on their platform, which summarises the relevance of that work to wider society. Here at Taylor & Francis, we partnered earlier this year with Altmetrics, which allows us to be able to report on how our readers are engaging with the content on our platform in a wider framework, so not just citations, but also social media, news outlets, policy documents. And I think this article level reporting is something that our authors really value. This example that you can see on the slide here is they're two Taylor & Francis authors, and they carried out a longitudinal study into the inequalities of Roma people in Europe. And they chose to publish this open access, including all the data, specifically with the aim that the data from this study could then be reused to increase the social and political impact of that work, which I think is a really nice example of how our authors are really aware of making this data open can then have an effect on the real value and the impact of that work in real terms. So in terms of working with libraries and wider organisations on open access, I think Taylor & Francis are working hard. We have held quite a few workshops so far this year which facilitate researchers to get published, supporting them in the research process. And open access is always something that is high on the agenda at these events. So we usually partner with the library to host these. And as you can see here, so far we've successfully held events in Israel, Kazakhstan, Turkey, Italy, so very much a global representation there. And we have several more before the end of the year as well. We're also a part of several cross-stakeholder working groups with the aim of driving and sharing best practice. We've held several open access seminars in London, Washington and Brussels, which brought together funders, societies and institutions, again with the idea of sharing knowledge throughout the different stakeholders. We also have a dedicated author site. You can see the URL there on the screen. And this is something that's recently been relaunched and has some really great resources there, I think both for the library and for researchers in terms of open access. So that's definitely worth going and having a look at.
Okay, thanks Carolyn. So just to close the presentation, we'll talk a little bit about what universities are doing in helping authors transition through this culture change and bring about this open scholarly model. So like many institutions, here at Brunel, we've put together a centralised support team. So as you can see on the left, the bullet points, we've got a number of different areas that we support that relate to research. And as you can see, just one of those from the list is open access. And that's because there are a number of other disruptive influences that are challenging the status quo of scholarly communications. But as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, open access has been and continues to be a very important part in bringing about this transition. Okay, so yes, so with regards to open access, there's been a number of initiatives that Brunel has put forward, again which is common amongst other universities, and you might well find, you're most certain to find at least some of these taking place within your home institutions. So we have an institutional repository, Bureau, providing the means for authors to disseminate papers through agreed open access. We were a very early adopter of institutional repository which came to us back in 2006. We also have established a fund, a central fund for gold open access for all our authors, and that's been in place since 2008, which was 5 years before RCUK's block grant, 4 years before the Finch report. So in many respects we've been leading the way, but lots of institutions have had similar policies, really showing support in helping authors to bring about a cultural transition to open scholarship. Lots of institutions now have what's called a CRIS system, which is essentially a means for managing research information about publications, outputs and other research activities. This is a newer kind of system than an institutional repository. There's a whole array of different services or vendors, suppliers available. In fact, a number of these now incorporate institutional repositories as part of a CRIS framework. But that's something we've brought in as well. Similarly, lots of other institutions will have done the same. And we've been managing the RCUK block grant, as I mentioned, since 2013. We've of course been working with publishers like Taylor and Francis, who are obviously developing new services and products and initiatives, which are again helping to bring this about. And finally, yes, so like many libraries, we've been involved in a number of crowd-funded initiatives and just funding a number of new models and developments which have been kind of taking place in the scholarly landscape. So there's been a number of new and interesting dissemination models like Knowledge Unlatched, which is essentially a crowd-funded model for publishing gold open access monographs, which we've been part of, like a number of institutions. There's Open Library of the Humanities, which is a similar not-for-profit crowd-funded organisation to establish fully gold open access journals for minimal or zero cost for authors. We're also supporting initiatives around metrics and impact, so watching very closely the developments around alternative metrics. We have an institutional implementation of the Altmetrics service provider for authors. Monograph initiatives like OAPEN, which is an enormous open access book repository, and the DOAJ as well. So all these new open services which are being funded in new and different ways. So like many libraries, we're taking part and supporting new drivers which are again helping to more swiftly bring this transition about. So we're engaging with new and interesting open access publishers across the landscape. But fundamentally we're building services that will help researchers navigate through a transformative culture change, and we're collaborating with our partners to help achieve this end. And that's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for coming. So this slide has got contact details for Carolyn, Chris and myself. So you're probably best off trying to get hold of us through Twitter, myself and Chris. I think Carolyn's got her email up there as well. I've also put the Twitter account for Brunel Library because being Open Access Week, we actually have a special event going on tomorrow. We're happy to welcome Natalia Majarovic from Altmetrics, and she's coming to speak at Brunel about open access and research impacts using Altmetrics to track attention to your research. So this event is going to be about using Altmetrics to understand broader interest in your research, and particularly focusing on Altmetrics and open access and how you can track attention to your open access research outputs. So if you'd like to come along, do please follow Brunel Library, and a link will be provided at around 2:45, 3 o'clock tomorrow UK time. Okay, thank you very much. So we'll close and open the floor to any questions you might have.
Okay, thank you, David. So we've only got 5 minutes left. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in. So I'm just going to have a look. If we start at the top of the list. Okay, so the first one on the list then I think came in nearer the beginning of the presentation, is possibly one for you and Chris, David. I think this was when you were talking about the benefits of open access at the start of the presentation, and the question is, what are the benefits for libraries? I think you talked about the benefits for researchers and funders and the general public, but what would you say are the benefits for libraries?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think because traditionally libraries have spent a lot of time, the role has very much been about ascertaining exactly what's needed for our collections in order to serve the research and teaching practices of our community, essentially. Open access, we're not in a fully open access world by any means yet. There's still a lot of resources that we need to continue to provide access to for our researchers and needed to support those activities. But it does offer a very interesting question in the future. If all papers are open access, if all papers are in repositories, if all papers are freely available from a publisher's platform, it does kind of really change the nature of what we mean by a collection. Libraries are obviously taking on these new services like discovery systems in order to bring people to resources that are open access, freely available, as well as their own kind of local library holdings. But in a world where everything is open access in the future, will there be a need for collections? I'm not sure. So it just certainly eliminates all issues to do with access, I think, which for the time being and foreseeable future will continue to be an activity that we support in the library. So I think that's the main benefit, I think, for us.
Yeah, I think as well, just to add to that, I mean, we touched earlier a bit on the impact of research, and I think as well that's kind of possibly another role for the library in terms of really demonstrating the impact of the institution. I think academic institutions are looking to be able to demonstrate that from the research that they're outputting. So I think the library is really playing a fundamental role in sort of developing that alongside open access.
I think as well what's really interesting is the part that we're now playing in supporting research is we're very much closer to the researchers and the part of the actual life cycle of publishing research as well. So we're obviously there in a facilitation role, particularly where we're administering funds for paying open access, where we're managing systems that monitor the research activity at the university. So I think we're sort of becoming more closer to supporting that activity at a service level than I think we ever have been before. So I think it's changing our role as the environment changes around us. So I think it's very interesting to see.
Oh, thank you. Okay, we'll just try and squeeze in one more. As I said, we have got quite a lot coming in. So again, this is probably one for you really, David. What advice would you have for an institution looking to set up their own repository for the first time?
Yes, well, I think there's coming out, there's certainly benefits coming to it at this kind of late stage in a way. As I said, we've had a repository since 2006, but institutions are kind of still without a repository coming into this kind of environment all the time, really. So I think you have the benefit of experience, perhaps. You can look back and see exactly what models have worked for different institutions. So there's a range of most of the repository software is open source. So I think DSpace, Fedora, ePrints are the main ones. But you also get commercial setups as well. So I think the main one would be Pure, which acts as a research management system, and you can also configure it to have repository functionality as well. And they've all kind of got different strengths and weaknesses. So I think it depends, mapping against what your requirements are as an institution to the main providers that are there in delivering repository software. And I think perhaps time is a bit short, so perhaps better end it there. Yeah, if you want to ask anything further, you've got our Twitter details, and do feel free to get in touch and follow up what we've been talking about.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for joining. A recording of this will be sent out later today, so you will be able to listen again if you missed anything. So yeah, have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.